They incited fear into the nations of the world. Fear created from an illusionary villain, intimidation. A common enemy needs a common reason for unification. They want no resistance to absolute control and economic growth, and political steering of member states. Yes, America can give the world peace, but it is a piece of the expansion of the invisible American dictatorship. America has expanded its control beyond its borders. Anyone who opposes is propagated as an enemy of peace and equality. It has been a tool for the assimilation and manipulation of the resources of the world. America has no enemy. They have set up a climate favoring the World Bank and its policies and puppet governments. In 1944, at the international conference held in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, the IMF was born. Conceived from the ruins of a post-war Europe, the World Bank has created a vast web of exploitation and intrigue. Its victims, none other than potentially its greatest rivals, the so-called Third World countries. 800 delegates attended the Bretton Woods Conference at the invitation of the then President of the United States, F.D. Roosevelt. And it was at this conference, to a delegation still riddled by the ensuing wars, that America made its intentions clear. Free trade with no discrimination against U.S. goods. A favorable climate for American investment in foreign economies. And unimpeded access to raw materials. F.D. Roosevelt sold his policy on the back of the chimera that only free trade could guarantee post-war peace. Free trade equals equality. Equality equals peace. He argued that the 1930s Great Depression had allowed fascism to reign and that the currency disorders had destroyed the basis for international trade and investment. Bewilderment and bitterness had become the breeders of fascism, and fascism had led to a war America had to end. In 1960, the International Development Association, the IDA, was established. Its aim was to provide interest-free loans to the world's poorest countries, unable to afford the IBRD's terms of agreement. These loans gave an impression of being lenient. They are not. It is these loans from the IDA which are responsible for the present debt burden of today's poorest countries. Mexico, India, Brazil, Indonesia, Turkey, China, Philippines, Argentina, Korea, Colombia, Morocco and Nigeria all still struggle under their financial burden that repayment of the IDA loans have created on their economies. Their peoples live lives of misery and squalor, and yet no one stands accountable. Hiding behind the mask of national reconstruction, it is the World Bank's intention to force third world countries into submission and render them financially handicapped and politically weakened. And it is to Robert Strange McNamara, President of the World Bank, from April 1, 1968 to June 30, 1981, that credit is given. He masterminded the plot, which was to make the World Bank the most powerful establishment in the world. His previous role as United States Defense Secretary gave him first-hand knowledge of world systems and how they might be manipulated and controlled. It was he who introduced the concept of the World Bank's moral obligation to relieve world poverty. McNamara's motives were undoubtedly political. Behind the zealous, crusading front, McNamara was calculating and scheming. He wore the hat of political activist as a means to an end. And it was in this crusading disguise that the World Bank began its strategic domination of the poorer nations of the world. Third world countries were recklessly bombarded with IDA loans. The borrowing governments rarely refused a loan or worried about their position to repay it. To the investors, World Bank involvement signaled to the rest of the world that they had nothing to fear. It had become a necessary seal of approval. McNamara's final legacy had far more sinister consequences. His parting gift was the era of structural adjustment, known as policy-based lending. These loans came with inescapable conditions, insensitive to the individual and cultural needs of the countries involved. Conditions which possess the ambition of transforming entire societies, setting a new set of westernized social goals. Programs that have since devastated the lives of millions of people, whilst making the World Bank very rich indeed. McNamara's prime concern was in fact to obtain a state of general stability for himself and his country. His solution to the dreaded communist threat was not to eradicate poverty, as he pretended, but to bring poorer nations under his control. It was not his intention to create conditions for economic and social progress in the lesser developed areas of the world, but in fact to create a system so entangled and indebted to America as to remove any threat of political rebellion. By fueling the irrationality and self-destructiveness of unbridled emotion, greed, aggressiveness, hatred, ignorance, and inertia, the World Bank has brought many, if not all, third world countries to submission. Order, stability, and security for the North has been obtained through elimination of any political, financial, or social opposition. Although McNamara left the bank more than a decade ago, his policies hauntingly remain. In 1979, the World Bank launched its carefully devised lending systems in the form of structural adjustment loans and pectoral adjustment loans. These loans tap into the very core of a country's political and financial infrastructure and spread like a disease to its peoples. The main incentive of the bank's loans is to liberalize the rules and regulations of a country in a direction favorable to America and Americans. With 4 types of loans and the capacity to coordinate them strategically, the World Bank controls many aspects of investments, institutional development, and public policy in nearly 150 nations. High African officials say TINA, short for there is no other alternative. A vicious web of catch-22s from which there is no return. The World Bank has to be held accountable. And yet the bank continues unopposed, preaching market theology and avoiding the consequences of those misreadings. The bank wins